It was a quiet autumn evening in 1923 when the small, isolated town of Westfield, Ohio, found itself at the mercy of something it could not comprehend, something that would forever change its history. The train tracks that ran through the heart of the town were usually just a simple utilitarian route for freight, bringing supplies and goods from the larger cities. But that night, the whistle of a passing train was different. It wasn't the sound of industry or progress. It was the sound of something far more unsettling. As the evening fog began to creep in, the townspeople saw an unfamiliar figure step off the train. A man dressed in a dark, tattered coat, his hat pulled low to obscure his face. He was carrying nothing but an old leather suitcase, its edges frayed with age. The man, known only as Mr. Blackwell, walked into Westfield without a word, but his presence stirred something in the air. It was as if the very earth beneath the town had been disturbed. Soon after, a strange procession began. Carriages drawn by horses, their hooves silent against the cobblestones. Each vehicle was laden with enormous garish banners, strange symbols embroidered in gold thread that no one recognized. The vehicles seemed to appear out of nowhere, pulling up in the dead of night, their passengers too shadowed to be identified. Rumors swirled among the few who had seen them, whispers of something dark, something ancient, but none could quite put it into words. By the time dawn broke, a grand spectacle had begun to take shape. In the heart of Westfield, a sprawling carnival had risen seemingly from the earth. Its massive tents stretched far beyond what should have been possible in such a small town. Tents with glowing red stripes that shimmered even in the daylight, their colors far too vivid to be natural. The air smelled faintly of something sweet but cloying, and the town square, usually so tranquil, felt charged with an energy no one could explain. It wasn't long before the strange workers began to emerge. They moved like shadows, their faces always turned away, their voices soft and inaudible. Some townsfolk claimed to have seen them during the night, their eyes glowing faintly as they scurried about, preparing the carnival for its grand opening. The animals, too, were unlike any seen before, large, twisted creatures that resembled a mixture of familiar beasts, but their forms were contorted in ways that defied logic. A lion with eyes like embers, a horse whose mane seemed to writhe like living tendrils. The centerpiece of it all, however, was the freak show. Unlike any show the town had ever seen, this exhibit promised to be something far darker. Locals who had ventured too close spoke of strange figures in cages, their forms hidden beneath thick layers of cloth, only their eyes visible, eyes that burned with a strange intensity. But it wasn't until the town's sheriff, Daniel Hayes, ventured inside that the truth began to unravel. Hayes disappeared that night, along with several others who had dared to enter the mysterious tents. The town was in a panic, and by the time morning came, the carnival was gone, vanished without a trace, as though it had never been there at all. But some say that Mr. Blackwell still roams Westfield, watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. And perhaps, just perhaps, he's waiting for you.
It wasn't the usual freight train. For one, it had no cargo cars, only a strange procession of ornate covered wagons, each one draped in heavy patterned cloths that seemed to glimmer under the moonlight. The first few residents who noticed it assumed it was some sort of traveling show, perhaps a circus or a carnival, though it was far later than such spectacles usually arrived. But when the train passed and the wagons began to pull into the overgrown field just outside the town's edge, a strange sense of unease gripped those who saw it. The atmosphere shifted, as if the town itself knew something was about to change. The townspeople, largely made up of farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers, were not accustomed to outsiders. They were a close-knit community, content with the rhythm of their lives,
and they didn't take kindly to intrusions. But something about this arrival felt different, almost deliberate, as if the show, or whatever it was, had chosen Westfield for a reason. Rumors began to spread almost immediately. Stories of strange workers unloading the wagons, all dressed in dark, tattered clothing, their faces obscured by heavy hoods or veils. The only thing visible were their eyes that seemed to glint with something unsettling. As the evening progressed, word spread like wildfire. A few brave souls ventured down to the field to get a closer look. The town's sheriff, Samuel Hayes, among them, tried to approach the newcomers with caution. But as he drew near, a sense of dread washed over him, and he found himself standing at the edge of the field, unable to take another step. In the distance, faint laughter echoed from behind the tents, mingling with strange, unearthly music that seemed to drift on the wind. It wasn't the sound of a typical carnival. It was more haunting, like something ancient and forgotten stirring in the night. Despite the growing apprehension, the carnival set up quickly, as if it had done this many times before. The workers moved in a trance-like fashion, their movements precise but unnerving. By morning, the show was ready, brightly colored tents against the gray backdrop of the early dawn. It was the sort of spectacle that demanded attention. The townsfolk, though hesitant, couldn't resist the allure of the unknown. Curiosity got the better of them. Among the first to attend was Marjorie Collins, a young widow whose husband had passed away under mysterious circumstances just 2 years prior. She had heard whispers of the strange events happening in town, but as someone who had known grief too well, she felt drawn to the carnival. Perhaps it was the promise of excitement in a life that had become all too ordinary, or perhaps something more, otherworldly. As she walked closer to the tents, Marjorie's heart began to race. The air felt thicker here, heavier, as if it were pushing her toward the entrance. Inside the largest tent, she found herself face to face with a spectacle unlike anything she had ever seen. An odd collection of creatures and performers, each more bizarre than the last. There were contorted figures, half human, half animal, their twisted limbs jerking in time with the strange music. Marjorie recoiled, but couldn't tear her eyes away. It was then that she saw the man at the center of it all. Tall and imposing, his presence seemed to dominate the space. He was dressed in elaborate, ancient-looking robes, and his eyes, those eyes, glowed with an unnatural intensity. He gazed directly at Marjorie, and in that instant, she knew this was no ordinary carnival. This was something darker, something far more dangerous than any of them had bargained for, and it was only just beginning. As she turned to leave, a voice, cold and smooth, whispered from behind her, "You've come seeking answers, but answers come with a price." Marjorie froze. The air around her seemed to close in, and she turned slowly, only to find the man standing much closer than before. The carnival had not just arrived in Westfield. It had been waiting for someone, and that someone, it seemed, was her. As the train rumbled past, it wasn't just the oddity of the wagons that unsettled the town. The air itself seemed to change, thickening, growing colder, as if something ancient had stirred beneath the earth. Some of the town's older residents whispered about things they had heard in their youth. Strange tales of a traveling group that came once every few decades, bringing not just entertainment, but a deeper, darker presence. Yet, no one had seen such a thing in living memory, and most dismissed it as superstition. But as the wagons settled at the edge of town, a sense of unease began to spread. That night, at the local tavern, whispers filled the air. "There's something off about them," said Tom Granger, a burly farmer who had been the first to spot the strange train. His voice was low, but carried the unmistakable edge of fear. You ever seen people like that before? Those performers. I don't care what kind of show they're putting on, but it's no good. His words, though dismissed by some as the ramblings of a man who had too many drinks, lingered in the back of the minds of others. Several townsfolk decided to take a look for themselves the following evening. By the time the sun had set, the carnival had come to life, with lanterns casting an eerie glow across the fields where the wagons had parked. Strange music floated through the air, a haunting melody unlike any the town had heard before. It was then that the first of the performers appeared, tall, thin figures draped in black, their faces hidden by long hoods. They moved with an unnatural grace, gliding across the ground without ever seeming to lift their feet. Some of the bolder townsfolk watched from the edge of the field, but none dared approach. The workers set up the largest tent in the center of the carnival, a towering structure that seemed to pulsate with an almost magnetic energy, drawing people closer, though many were afraid to enter. Word quickly spread that the show would begin at midnight, and though many were hesitant, curiosity overpowered caution. A crowd began to form, but not everyone made it inside the tent. A few, like the local blacksmith's daughter Mary, tried to approach the performers directly. As she neared one of them, a woman with eyes as pale as moonlight, she felt a sudden chill run down her spine, a sensation that seemed to twist the air around her. The woman said nothing, only stared with those unblinking eyes, her lips curling into a faint, unsettling smile. Mary froze, unable to move, the weight of the woman's gaze anchoring her in place. Before she could even process what had happened, the woman turned and vanished into the shadows of the tent. Inside, the show had already begun. Those brave enough to enter were greeted by grotesque displays. Twisted, malformed creatures performing acrobatics and contorting in ways that defied human possibility. There was a man who balanced on his head for minutes, his body folding in half, as though it were made of rubber. In the center of the tent, a fire breather with skin cracked like porcelain stood, the flames dancing around him in a bizarre, unnatural rhythm. But it wasn't just the performances that were wrong. The very air inside the tent felt wrong, thick with an odd energy. Some people claimed to hear whispers, voices that weren't their own, calling them by name. Others felt themselves growing faint, dizzy, as if something was draining the very life from them. As the night dragged on, more and more townsfolk were drawn to the carnival, some in awe, others in fear. No one could explain what it was, but the grip it had on Westfield was undeniable. The show went on, but every minute that passed seemed to pull them deeper into something they couldn't understand, something they weren't sure they wanted to. Outside, the few remaining townsfolk who hadn't ventured into the tent exchanged nervous glances. Something wasn't right. But what could they do? The carnival had arrived, and it wasn't about to leave anytime soon. The following morning, the town woke to a fog that clung to the streets like a shroud, making everything feel distant and uncertain. By noon, whispers had begun to spread like wildfire. Stories of strange figures seen wandering near the edge of the woods and figures standing by the train tracks late into the night. Most disturbing of all were the children, those who had gone to see the carnival the evening before. They spoke in hushed voices, their faces pale, their eyes wide with something unspoken, something that sent a chill through anyone who asked them what they had seen. The more they tried to explain, the more tangled their words became, as though they couldn't fully grasp what had happened or what they had witnessed. Some of the more curious townsfolk ventured toward the carnival grounds, hoping to see for themselves what was causing all the fuss. But as they approached the area, they were met with an odd stillness, a silence that hung heavier than it should have. The tents were gone. The wagons were no longer parked along the field, nor were there any signs of the performers who had put on such a bizarre show the night before. In fact, the entire area looked as if it had never been touched, as if the carnival had never existed at all. Only the faint smell of burning incense lingered in the air, and an eerie sense of unease seemed to seep into the very earth beneath their feet. The townspeople returned to their homes, confused, but most assumed they had simply imagined the strange event. However, a few remained unconvinced. In particular, Amos, the town's sheriff, who had seen far too many things in his years to dismiss the mystery so easily, began his own quiet investigation. He scoured the woods near the carnival site, but found nothing. No broken branches, no discarded props, no sign that anything unusual had taken place at all. The deeper he ventured, though, the more he began to feel watched, as if unseen eyes were upon him. A sense of dread grew inside him, gnawing in his stomach, but he couldn't explain why. Meanwhile, a few brave souls went to the railroad depot to inquire about the mysterious train. They found no answers there either. The station master, a gruff man named Henry, claimed he hadn't seen a train pass through in days. According to his records, no train had even stopped in Westfield for weeks. The tracks, in fact, showed no signs of recent use. But then, as the group turned to leave, Henry added something that made their blood run cold. "There's been talk," he said in a low voice, "about trains that come at night. Trains that don't show up in the records. They come, and they leave. No one remembers them, except for the ones who see them." As the days passed, the unease in the town only grew. At night, the fog thickened, wrapping around the houses and streets, suffocating the usual sounds of crickets and distant dogs. The town had become a place of whispers, where every creak of floorboards, every gust of wind, seemed to carry with it an unspoken threat. And then, one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the town heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a train whistle. But this time, it wasn't coming from the tracks. It was coming from the woods. The air grew heavy with the smell of burnt rubber and incense, and shadows began to stretch unnaturally across the town. Amos, now deeply shaken, could hear the faint sounds of music and laughter coming from somewhere in the distance, sounds that didn't belong in the quiet town of Westfield. In the distance beyond the trees, something was waiting, something that had been here before, something that had never truly left. As the days dragged on, the once bustling town of Westfield began to show signs of cracking under the strain. People started locking their doors at night, windows shuttered, voices lowering when the subject of the carnival was brought up. The children, those few who hadn't gone completely silent, began to speak of their dreams, dreams so vivid and unsettling that even the bravest adults couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One evening, as a group of residents gathered in the town square trying to make sense of the strange events, a young woman named Clara Jacobs, who had once worked as a school teacher, approached with a look of sheer terror on her face. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Without saying a word, she handed them a crumpled letter. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and the handwriting, scraggly, almost childlike, was scrawled across the page in frantic strokes. "They are not who they seem. They have come for us all." The letter was signed only with a single letter. M. Clara spoke up, voice trembling. "I've seen them. The people from the carnival. At night, when I thought everyone was asleep. They were standing outside my house, watching. And I'm sure of it now. They aren't human." At first, no one believed her. But then,
The odd occurrences began to multiply. The town's dogs started barking incessantly at night, as though they saw something just beyond the reach of sight. The church bells, which had been silent for years, suddenly began to ring at random times, always during the witching hour. And worst of all, several townsfolk, including Clara's younger brother Henry, began to disappear, their homes left eerily untouched, as though they had simply vanished into thin air. The tension in Westfield reached a boiling point when one of the town's most trusted figures, Sheriff Collier, announced that he had found something terrible. He led a group of volunteers to the woods behind the train tracks, hoping to find some answers. What they stumbled upon, however, was far worse than anyone could have imagined. A clearing hidden deep within the trees, where strange symbols had been carved into the bark of ancient trees. In the center, a massive stone structure, long forgotten by time, stood. An altar, blackened with age, surrounded by ritualistic markings. The group froze in horror as they realized what this meant. The carnival, and everything that had come with it, was not simply a group of wandering entertainers. It was a trap. A centuries-old pact had been made, one that demanded sacrifices from the very souls that dared to live within the town's borders. Sheriff Collier's voice quivered when he spoke again. "We've been marked. All of us." And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went silent. The sound of birds, once loud and constant, ceased entirely. The fog rolled in once again, thickening around them, suffocating the air. No one could see clearly through it, but a shadow moved within, a shape that loomed too large to be real, yet too close to ignore. The carnival had returned, and with it, the true terror had just begun. But this time, it wasn't just the town that was in danger. It was everyone within the reach of the fog. By the end of the week, a sense of dread had settled over Westfield, like a dark cloud. The strange figures that had appeared near the woods were no longer just rumors. They were real. One by one, townsfolk began to vanish without a trace. First, it was Mr. Holloway, the blacksmith, then young Ellie Parker, and even old Martha Jenkins, the town's librarian, who was last seen near the edge of the forest as dusk settled over the town. No one knew where they had gone, but every disappearance followed a disturbing pattern. Each person was seen looking toward the forest as if drawn by an invisible force, their eyes wide, their faces pale. It wasn't long before a group of the town's bravest men, including Samuel Blake, the sheriff, decided to venture into the woods, hoping to uncover whatever dark secret had come with the carnival. Armed with nothing but lanterns and their courage, they trekked through the dense trees, the air growing colder with each step. As they reached the heart of the forest, they stumbled upon something impossible, an enormous, eerie tent, exactly like the one that had appeared by the train tracks, but now standing impossibly far from where they had last seen it. It was as if the forest had somehow pulled it into its depths. The tent pulsed with a faint, unearthly glow, casting long shadows over the ground. Inside, the air hummed with a strange energy, an almost electric tension that sent chills through the men. The deeper they walked into the tent, the more the world outside seemed to fade away, the trees growing distant, the very air thick with dread. It was then that they saw them. Figures, shadowy and unsettling, their faces distorted in ways that were not human, standing motionless in the center of the tent. Samuel Blake, his heart hammering in his chest, tried to call out, but no sound came. He turned to his companions, only to find them frozen in place, staring ahead with eyes that were no longer their own. Something inside the tent was pulling at them, bending their wills, their very minds. Desperate, Samuel backed away, but the ground beneath his feet seemed to twist, the edges of his vision blurring. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her, Ellie Parker, standing amongst the figures, her eyes hollow, her body unmoving, as if she had been changed into something else entirely. Before he could scream, the ground cracked open beneath his feet, and the darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, the town awoke to find the carnival gone. The train tracks were empty, and the tents had vanished, as if they had never been there at all. The forest was quiet once more, but the disappearances didn't stop. Weeks passed, and new reports began to surface. Other towns were experiencing similar events. And then, one last chilling detail emerged. One of the survivors, an old man, trembling and broken, claimed he had seen the face of Samuel Blake. But it wasn't his own. It was a twisted, grotesque version of the sheriff's face, grinning from the shadows of the forest. And so, Westfield remained, forever changed, its quiet streets now a silent testimony to the darkness that had briefly walked among them. The town was on the brink of unraveling. Fear had become so palpable that people started whispering about leaving, about fleeing into the hills or heading to the next town, hoping to escape whatever curse had befallen them. But none of them dared leave the safety of their homes after dark. The fog, thick as ever, seemed to mock them, creeping into every crack and crevice, as though the town itself was slowly being swallowed whole. On the seventh night, as the clock struck midnight, a group of the remaining townsfolk gathered in the town square, their faces drawn and tense. They had decided, if they were to survive, they would have to confront whatever force had arrived in their town. Among them was Robert Hayes, a former soldier who had lived in Westfield his whole life, and his younger sister, Clara, who had been one of the few to stand up to the stories and rumors. They were determined to find out the truth, to stop whatever had begun before it claimed anyone else. As they made their way toward the edge of the woods, the air grew colder, the wind carrying an eerie stillness. They reached the clearing where the carnival had set up all those days ago, but there was nothing there. Not a single tent, not a wagon in sight. It was as if the entire spectacle had never existed at all. Yet the ground was disturbed, the earth churned and uneven, as if something had been moved, something hidden beneath. With growing unease, Robert knelt and began to dig. Clara watched nervously, her hand on her brother's shoulder. Then, the ground gave way. A large old trunk surfaced from beneath the earth, coated in mud and grime, yet somehow untouched by time. The scent of damp wood filled the air, mixing with the stale odor of decay. Robert pried open the lid, and both of them recoiled in shock. Inside there was no treasure, no gold or jewels, no trinkets of value. Instead, there were faded photographs, cracked mirrors, and strange carvings etched into the wood. It was then that Clara saw it. Among the trinkets was a weathered letter, its paper crumbling to dust at the edges. She carefully unfolded it, the words faded but legible. For those who seek, the answer lies not in the past, but in the blood of the land. Before they could even react, a low rumbling sound echoed through the trees, as if the very earth itself was groaning in pain. From the shadows, figures began to emerge, tall, cloaked in tattered robes, their faces hidden behind masks of porcelain. The figures walked slowly, deliberately, surrounding Robert and Clara. They had seen these figures before, among the carnival workers, but now they were different, darker, more threatening. The realization hit them like a thunderclap. The carnival wasn't just a show, it was a ritual, and the town of Westfield had been its offering. The figures spoke in unison, their voices hollow and ancient. The land has fed.
the cycle is complete. As the figures advanced, Robert reached for the trunk again, desperate for something, anything that could stop them. In that moment, Clara grasped the letter tightly and whispered the words aloud, her voice trembling. Blood of the land. Suddenly, the ground shook, the fog thickening, and the air grew still. The figures stopped, their eyes, if they had eyes, fixated on her. There was a long, heavy silence, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fog lifted. The figures were gone. The trunks, the carnival, everything vanished without a trace. Westfield was still, silent, but it would never be the same. As Clara and Robert stood in the now empty clearing, the weight of what had just happened settled on them. They had not stopped the ritual. They had only postponed it. And as they left the woods behind, they understood one undeniable truth. Something far older than they could comprehend had been awakened, and it would one day return. But for now, they were the last two to leave Westfield, and neither of them would ever forget the things they had seen.